Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes, this is it. This is Landlord Mapper, the National Landlord Database Initiative. So I'm going to go ahead and get right to it because there's a lot to go over. So, quick overview of this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, how did I get here. I'm going to tell a story. I have a very personal experience that was the primary impetus for this project. I'm going to go over the initiative itself, talk a little bit about the tech, the data, give the live demo, talk about next steps, and then we got the Q&A. So, who am I? Why am I doing this? I studied my major is international studies, and I did a project in Colombia, and I learned a lot about the Colombian armed conflict. I learned about a lot about the US responsibility for a lot of what happened in Colombia. And that really just motivated me to get involved in class politics when I graduated and when I moved to Chicago. So I moved to Chicago in June 2018 and had a bad experience with the landlord pretty much right away. And so I went and got involved in the local tenant union, ATU out of Albany Park. And I was mostly what I did was the Spanish to English interpretation during the meetings because there's a lot of monolingual Spanish speakers that participate in the unions, that organize the meetings. And I also participated, I sort of tagged along on a campaign against landlord George Triff. And I just had a quick quote here from the Chicago Tribune article about the campaign, where he allegedly was evicting a Mexican family of five from their apartment for complaining to the city about the heat after having to take their baby to the hospital when it turned blue because the temperature went from 45 to 85 inside of their apartment. And you can see here having really no remorse for that. Remember him, remember George Triff. We're going to go back and look at his properties later. That was my experience in Chicago with the union. And then now to the story that really gets at the heart of why I'm doing this. This happened in LA. I moved to LA in July 2022. Moved around a lot during COVID, during and after COVID. Found myself in LA. Had a particularly nasty experience with the landlord, and I'm not going to go into too many details. You can ask me about it later in the Q&A if you're really interested. But I decided I was going to try to knock on doors and form a tenant association. And so I spent a lot of time researching this landlord. And that means the county assessor website, that means the LLC searches. And I saw that he was using different last names to put down for his property taxes. He was using his and his wife's last name, two different last names. And in the correspondence that other tenants would later send to me in the evidence folder, he was using both last names in the correspondence with the tenants. So I was I was like, okay, this dude is getting away with systematic tenant harassment, and he's trying to make sure nobody knows who he is, or like that no one can be 100% sure who he is. And that really just incensed me to action. And so in all these buildings, I met people who were angry enough to want to talk about lawsuits within 10 seconds of talking to me when I was knocking on my door, when I was knocking on their doors. And, I made the group chat, made the cross-building group chat. I talked to the tenants in all these buildings. The worst story I heard was a Salvadoran family who had their roof cave in during a rainstorm, and the landlord just ignored it because of the rent control laws. I say systematic tenant harassment because in I can go more into this later in the Q&A too, but basically landlords can't raise rent on rent controlled buildings unless the current tenants voluntarily move out. And so you can imagine then the incentive that exists for these landlords to be abusive and stuff like that. And they put this Salvadoran family through hell. And they made them get the lawyer, had to spend weeks with a destroyed kitchen. And all that's to say, that just made me more and more inspired to, not inspired, I guess. I'll go back to incensed. It made me incensed to try to blow the whistle on this. And so I tried to form the union. And here I just have some examples of some things that I would put up, some flyers, union agitation. This is to join the group chat. This is a link to the other QR code is a link to the Yelp pages. Here's a printout of some of the Yelp reviews, just trying to make people feel that they're not alone. Because when you experience abuse from your landlord, or when your landlord isn't fixing things and you're miserable because of it, it can feel very isolating and lonely, especially when you don't know your neighbors. And so this is me just sort of putting out the call to action, like let's start talking, let's get organized. At this point, the landlord infiltrated the group chat that I had made. And he later then pretty much immediately started harassing all he like tracked down all the numbers in the group chat. He saw that my number was the administrator. And so then people in the chat were like, why am I getting these emails? Like, this is sketchy. I'm out. And so then at that moment, it sort of fell apart. I tried to organize a potluck. It's the thing about the tenant union, and this is also something else I could talk about later, is that without community, without neighbors like knowing each other, it is really hard to get people to be down with organizing a tenant union because it is risky. Like you can seriously get your life messed up if a landlord wants to go that hard against you. So anyway, at that point, I had had this confrontation with the landlord in the hallway when he illegally entered my unit. I was trying to give him a time all day, and he was being weird about responding. And he told me to my face that he was not the landlord. He told me his name, but then he's like, I'm not the landlord. And I just thought that was just such shocking cowardice to me. And so, given all that, given what I knew, what I heard from that Salvadoran family, also one of their neighbors talked about witnessing the landlord at one point allegedly spitting at a tenant. And so, after hearing all of that, and then after having him enter my room, I was just like, no, okay, I'm going to blow the whistle on this person because there's is such a gross injustice that this person is getting away with this and nobody knows. Nobody's talking about it. And the tenants, it's like, you don't like it, get out. As a tenant, you're not going to go through all the effort to sue a landlord. Anyway, last flyer I put up, this is the most incendiary. This has both of his names that he was using on his tax documents and his personal phone number, which I had because I know he infiltrated the group chat because he immediately left the group chat and then proceeded to harass people in it. So how did he respond? I'm going to go quickly over these. I could talk more about these too, but I think this captures really uh, this portrays the narrative that the Landlord Mapper initiative is trying to shift, and the direction is trying to shift it towards. This is the eviction notice. This is the perform covenants or quit type, where if I just stop doing it, he rescinds it. This is specifically for flyering. First cease and desist letter. The threat defamation lawsuit. Fun fact, threats to sue for defamation are one of the most common tactics that landlords use against organizers as a form of political repression and intimidation. And so this is me getting one, the first cease and desist letter. Second cease and desist letter accused me of stuffing my drains, which is interesting because I got this. I was out of town. I'd been out of town for like 5 days at that point. Just bold face, false accusation, intimidation. Pretty standard, really, for landlords threatening organizers. Here's some public harassment, talking about how they promote love and peace in the building, not fear and hatred, accusing me of posting hatred and spreading misinformation. Here's another one. This is when they printed out the email that I sent to them telling them I was moving out and thanking their tenants for the overwhelming support and taking the time to take down the messages of hatred that I was posting. I got this really bizarre email from the landlord's lawyer, which is talking about a Craigslist post selling French bulldog puppies with the landlord's email and phone number on the post, and sort of just like implicitly accusing me of doing it, and with a veiled threat of like, if you do this, like how illegal would that be to use someone else's information, right? This is a letter from the LAPD. This is an investigator contact form with a reference number and a detective's name for theft report that I received after basically surrendering and telling the landlord I was moving. Please let me leave in peace. I promise cooperation. I just want to get away from you. 5 days later, I got a second letter from the LAPD with a different reference number and a different detective name. And at this point, I'm like, what is going on? I actually have no idea what's going on. And that's when the thought crossed my mind, like, am I about to get my life ruined somehow? I just have no idea what's going on. And then I get a text to my a phone line that had disconnected or that I'd stopped using but was still connected. And I turned on the phone one day and I get this text from a detective. And that's the same reference number as on the second LAPD correspondence I received. And so what this looked like was it looked like this they were responding to a report that I made. That's what it looked like. And I've never made a police report in my life. And so I had absolutely no idea what was happening. I moved out though in January, tried to follow up with the police. They just didn't reply. And I moved out and then I didn't hear anything from the landlord. So I was like, all right, I guess it's over. I guess I dodged a bullet. Like that was crazy. Then 2 months later, out of nowhere, I get a third cease and desist letter telling me, threatening immediate legal action if I don't delete the group chats that I made, which I did because I was done. And then 1 month later, in the LATU organizer group chat, which I was still in, even though I had left the city, I saw this text about a phones app, and one of the demands was to get the landlord to stop all forms of harassment, including false accusations and false police reports. And so I guess I didn't realize before that it is not uncommon or unheard of for landlords as a form of political repression to make fake police reports in the names of their tenants that are organizing against them. And so it was this experience right here, the experience with a landlord that tried to tell me he wasn't the landlord and that was using multiple last names to file his property taxes. This is what brought me to a realization. Everywhere in this country, from the big cities to the small towns, the high rises, the trailer parks, criminal landlords are running wild. I think about these two words a lot. I think these two words are really important to to consider when talking about housing justice, talking about landlordism, and when talking about landlord impunity specifically. And big shout out to Alejandra and Maya for their Tenant Trap series. I think this is an excellent illustration of what's going on. And I know they already presented a few months ago, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But there's one thing that's really stood out to me in one of the articles, and it was that landlords since 2008, of all of the fines that have been imposed on landlords since 2008, where does it say? It's blocking it. More than half of this money has not been paid. How could it be that landlords are being fined and not paying? Imagine if you got a parking ticket and you just didn't pay. Imagine what the consequences would be. They could garnish your wages, they go after your credit, send collections after you, they might restrict your license. But the landlords, they can just not pay and like, are there any consequences? I thought that was really concerning. And so that brings me to the initiative. This initiative is about getting to that question that I put on the last flyer. Who is the landlord? The purpose of this initiative is to bring transparency to the rental market and to empower tenants with information about who their landlord is. We want to help tenants and community leaders blow the whistle on criminal landlords. We want to address this asymmetry of information and the ownership obscurity, which refers to landlords using LLCs and shell companies, trusts, all that to hide their properties. Housing prices worsening. Many of us are staring down a lifetime of renting, and landlord power is deeply entrenched in this country. And similar in a way to that the healthcare companies hold the population hostage because healthcare is a necessity, the landlord class in that similar way is holding the renter class hostage because our options are rent or be homeless. So that's the impetus for the project. What is the project? It is a research tool. It is a database, and it is an initiative to advance the data methodologies that have been proposed in past research to get this data. I could go deeper into the data in the Q&A if you'd like. It's a lot. I wrote a methodology paper. I'll link to it. You can check out all the details of how I got this data. But one important thing to note about the data, this is not going to get the biggest landlords. The biggest landlords are too well hidden. This is going to get like the next rung below, and then all the ones at the bottom. with a caveat that there are no enforced data quality standards for taxpayer records submitted by landlords to the city of Chicago. String matching, network graph generation. The network graph is what you see in the image on your right, and then a lot of manual address research. Tech stack, pretty basic front-end tech stack. For the map itself, can go into that more later, but I want to save time for the demo. So this is Landlord Mapper, and I'm going to showcase a few things that you can do and see on it. So remember George Triff, the landlord from the ATU campaign? We're going to check out some of his properties. So you just search the name right here, you click on it, press go. And so one example of how the power of the string matching is that if you look at the taxpayer records for George Triff, look at how many different ways his names are spelled. His name is spelled. Geore Triff, Geroge Triff, George Trigg. And with the string matching, that was able to pick up on that. And so we can see here, George Triff, if we look at his landlord data, estimated monthly rent collected, can go more into that calculation later if you are interested. And yes, you can look at the properties on the map, you can click on them and show the specific building data. You can look at all this stuff. And I'm going to show off now a second building. And this is actually a building I used to live in. Shout out Yelena, my old landlord. And this is an example. This is a good example of the data methodologies and how you can switch between them to see more more buildings and more taxpayer records associated with the landlord network. So this is a network graph for my old landlord. And these are taxpayer records or LLCs or corporations or anything that connected the nodes and edges to this connected component. You can see all the LLC information. Watch what happens when I change the methodology calculation from a less liberal estimation to a more liberal, which basically refers to which addresses are included in the network graph generation. Look at how much bigger that is. And so having the different methodologies that you can switch back and forth from will allow you to see connections that if you took a really conservative estimate would not appear. I'm going to show you another building I used to live in. Whoops. And there's a tutorial if you want to look at, try to figure out how to use it. One of the biggest challenges in this kind of research is differentiating between ownership structures. Property management company might not be the true owners. So who are the true owners? Well, you can't really tell. But it is nonetheless important to be able to associate the properties with the property management company because there's a level of aspect of accountability there, right? And so my old building was a Burst building, and you can see in the taxpayer record, Kedzie 46 LLC is the name of the property taxpayer. But under associated organizations, this is the manual address research that I did. You can click on them, and these are all the Burst buildings. And you can see down here in the buildings list, the taxpayer address, it's all the same. That's the Burst office. Now I want to turn the attention to, I'm going to show you all the homepage, which I built out here. These are some buttons. Sign up for the newsletter. I'll put that link in the chat if you want to get updates on new features and just general updates about the initiative. Got a ward map here. Added these shapes in. I like the ward shapes. I think it's a beautiful map. I really like the combination of the colors and the shapes of the wards themselves. There's something beautiful about it. I don't know. And you can see here just a basic information about the ward. You can click on the email. It'll send and open up a new email. Oh, can't drag that into the window. Yeah, well, you can email the ward office if you click on that. I got these lists of landlords here, and you can sort the lists by the different metrics. And, we got lists by open violations. We got lists by the most heavily fined landlords. And then we got the scofflaw list, which I could talk more about scofflaw in the Q&A if people are interested. My favorite part is the watch list. This is the landlord watch list for Chicago. This is basically a group of landlords that either own a lot of properties, have a lot of open violations, collect a lot of rent every month, estimated rent counts, which are the actual rent that these landlords are bringing in is likely much higher. But nonetheless, we can still find the biggest ones in the data, and also landlords that have been very heavily fined. So if I scroll down this list, you can see here we got Matt Janko, Dwayne Ayresman, Sal Bakovich, Sean Coley, Diane Gottlieb, William Cavacci, Trent Anderson, Mark Fishman, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to show you what happens when we click on one. This is Gary Carlson. He's one of he's been in the news. You all can Google his name, you can find the articles. But yeah, this is his data. This is list of open violations, list of his buildings. You could turn on and off the wards here, click on them. You could do that for the census tracts too, if you want to see toggle between the different census metrics to style the layer. Oh, that's a bug. I want to look at the Map Explorer mode too, because the Map Explorer, I think this is a really cool part of the program because this lets you do exactly what it's called. It lets you explore the map. It lets you filter the top landlords in the city in the data set by all these different fields. So you could filter by different units, different buildings. The data looks a lot different when you filter by the different metrics, assessed value, and then you could also change the calculation. So when you change this calculation, this is the thing that I showed with the network graphs earlier with my old landlord. That changes how the networks are calculated, which changes the overall top landlords in the data set. So the goal of it is really just to let people investigate landlords, let people explore the data, and it also works on mobile. So if you ever have to go out to do an apartment showing, for example, you could search the property and look at all the data and have that knowledge and be equipped with that knowledge going into any kind of rental situation, which would otherwise be quite time consuming to get without Landlord Mapper. The code. The code to get the landlord data is published and it is under a GNU General Public License. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have in store, what I'd like to do next. Org mode, we're going to publish the tenant hotline data that MTO has agreed to share with us, Metropolitan Tenants Organization. That will allow us to see which landlords are getting the most tenant hotline calls, the tenant crisis hotline calls. We need to auto update the database. As of now, it does not auto update. That's a lot of extra work. It's a top priority of ours, though. We'd love to add a review system where people can review landlords. We think that's a great direction to go. We need to refine the data methodology because it is imperfect. There are limitations. So much more time can be invested in it. And of course, we also want to collaborate and work with others and try to create a space for landlord research and for empowering tenants with information about landlords and their properties. And I also want to talk about funding because 8 months ago, I was part of the tech layoffs. I lost my day job, and seeing the situation in the job market, I just decided to go 100% in on Landlord Mapper instead of try to get another job. And so the week I lost my job, I founded a nonprofit organization to house this initiative. It's called Tech Tools for Justice. It received 501c3 status in July, and I do plan on applying for grants. I also floated the idea of raising money on Patreon and maybe even making a podcast one day, interviewing landlord organizers, lawyers, journalists, people who have gone head to head with landlord power in this country to try to shift the narrative towards one of a more material understanding of landlord power. And for that, I made the Patreon, and I'll pop that link in the chat as well. If you see value in this work, if you think this work is important and you want to see it grow, I would really love that you consider becoming a Patreon because I am extremely committed to this. I care about this a lot, and I am prepared to commit years of my life to it. So with that, I am at 24 minutes, and I'll go ahead and call it 1 minute early. Oh, actually, sorry, attributions and shoutouts. Big shout out to Jack Klicka. He's a friend and colleague, the other board member, Tech Tools for Justice. He has set up the site infrastructure for me, and that has been immensely helpful and has been and given a lot of general tech and strategy advice. Very grateful for him. John Bartlett, executive director at MTO. John, I've been in communication with John for months now, and I can see that John really believes in me, and that means a lot. Shout out to Autonomous Tenants Union, the Chicago Union of Tenants. They got the corporate and LLC data that was used in this project. So all credit for the corporate and LLC part of the data that was integrated into the workflow goes to their coalition of research, their research coalition. Shout out to LATU, they're doing amazing work. Shout out to JustFix, they make Who Owns What landlord research site in New York City, for New York City rather. They were a big inspiration for this project. And then Forrest Hang and Daniel O'Brien, their research on the string matching was critical for the data workflow that I used to get the Chicago data. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dylan. Um, so now we're at the Q&A portion. For folks in the audience, if you have a question, you can go ahead and pop it in the chat. And then, that way, we'll have a record and we'll know how to ask Dylan. So they're interested in understanding how you're calculating the estimated monthly rent for a landlord.
That's a great question. What I did, and I really just put this together, ultimately it's arbitrary calculation. This is a big room for improvement or a big room to like in a future iteration of the methodology. What I did was I took the average age. So for each census tract, because that's the level of the estimated rent, the US Census, American Community Survey, they do a yearly average rent statistic for each census tract. So with that, for each census tract, I took all the properties that were found in the census tract, all the buildings, took their average age and the average number of code violations that they had, and I basically created a weight based on the standard deviation of those averages per census tract, and then decreased. So for every unit the landlord owns in that census tract, the estimated rent of each unit, and that's just a question of multiplying the unit count associated with the landlord, the number of units they own in that census tract, multiplying it with those weights so that older buildings and buildings with more code violations had a lower estimated rent, whereas newer buildings with less code violations have higher than average rent. Ultimately, that is arbitrary. That's making assumptions about the world, right? We're assuming that landlords will keep the rent low if it's an older building or if it has a lot of violations, which a lot of times isn't true. But that was the logic behind it.
Yeah, thank you. So, going along with those, perhaps with those calculations, there's a question about a distinction when a property manager is not the owner. And the question is there a data source then for determining the property manager for a building?
This is a good time to talk about the manual address research that I did and how I incorporated it into the data model. Let me show the methodology paper because this, I think, is really what's necessary to get a good, accurate data model going for this. And that was section 4, page 13. Yeah, so this manual address research, this was me taking all the validated addresses in the entire data set, ordering them by frequency, the number of times they appear. So this is in the property taxpayer data. What are the most commonly appearing validated taxpayer mailing addresses? And I Googled and searched them in Google Maps, 3,000, the first 3,000. And I created a spreadsheet of everything, of my findings, basically. And what I found was incredibly interesting. There were a lot of law firms, a lot of banks, a lot of construction firms, a lot of businesses unrelated to real estate, manufacturing, transportation, auto body shops, a lot of lockbox services, a lot of UPS stores. And so I was doing this manual research and I just thought that this needs to be somehow connected to the data because a lot of the previous projects and previous iterations of this research, they get the network graph, they get all the nodes and the edges data for the connected components, and then it kind of stops there, or maybe there are other the research that I had found, the previous research didn't seem to go this extra step to try to attempt to model these relationships and model the domain so that you can approximate those real world relationships between property management companies and the buildings that they administer. And so what I did was I created a new database table that was called Landlord Entity. And Landlord Entity was every organization, business, anything that I had found on these addresses. I associated it with the address just in a regular in tabular data. And I had a bunch of Boolean columns to calculate them. And I added those Boolean columns right here. And this was a way that I tried to classify these organizations in a way that would be more precise than just network, LLC, corporation. And so what I ended up doing is and this is also arbitrary, but this is just me attempting to model these relationships, is I defined landlord organization as one of these entities, but one that can likely be held to account for the conditions of the buildings and the treatment of the tenants that are property management companies, developers, not financial service companies, realty companies. Whereas non-landlord, things that would not be considered landlord organizations, for example, law firms that help landlords establish the shell companies and trusts and whatnot, because it's a lot harder to hold them to account when they're just the landlord's their client. They'll just tell you, oh, you want to sue the landlord, you have to go find him. He's just my client. Of course, um, yeah, it's conjecture, but yes, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. I think that that's a lot of like really heterogeneous sources. So this kind of goes along with the question of from the audience that you mentioned that you're in the phase of trying to auto update or to build things to help you with the process. So the question is, can you what's required to do to auto update the data, and can you talk a little bit more about that?
We need to set up data pipelines. We need to set up a scrape job that detects property sales in the city of Chicago has an open data portal. It says that there's an API. I haven't connected to it yet, but ideally connect to their API and maybe every week run a job that gets all of the properties that have been sold since the job was last run, gets the PIN number, and then runs the scrape on the assessor site and collects the taxpayer record data. And that makes a big assumption that the new landlords, the new owners, are updating their property tax data in the system, which many times they do not. And so that's a big limitation, but that is the primary source where the data comes from. So we would be able to see who's not updating their taxpayer record very easily. We could have a list of properties right there on the homepage of landlords who haven't updated their taxpayer data. That could be cool. But then beyond running the scraper, it's just a matter of getting the all the most recent code violations and the assessment whenever the city publishes the assessment record and assessment data for the property for 2025, be a matter of getting that as well. And trying to think of anything else. Yes, we would also have to rerun the network code because some of the networks might have changed. And so that's just a matter of setting up a side job and then updating the database accordingly.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, this is a little bit of a different question. One of the questions is curiosity, has there been pushback from landlords about the program, about the project?
That is to be determined. I published the Chicago data yesterday, so uh, I
Yeah.
I'm equally as curious as you all are. It'll be interesting.
Okay. So now here's another question. Um, the question is about the visualizations that you've been using on the website, which are great. Um, Can you talk a little bit about how you're teaching people to tell stories using the website? So I suppose that this is going to be in progress, right? Um, but I think, yeah, that's the question. People telling stories using the data from the website.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that that question got asked. One thing that I think could be really powerful about helping people understand the context of where some of these landlords have their buildings and where they're operating. If we look at the census data in the census tracts, so Chicago, right? Everyone knows it's one of the most segregated cities racially in the country. You can look at some of these landlords and see that they have almost all of their properties in some of the black neighborhoods, and not even all the black neighborhoods. It might just be the west side. And if you look at Triple Maisel, for example, all of theirs are on the south side. And so what's going on here? I'm really interested in, for example, the concentration of property ownership and how it differs across different parts of the city, or how gentrification, the effects of gentrification can be visualized, and how we can see what would be really cool in the future over time is a change in the hands of properties. How many times properties have been bought and sold over the last 10, 15 years? We'd probably get a lot around here in Pilsen. So if we look at this is Podjemierski, I think is the name of this landlord. Can't remember. Look at where their properties are. Basically owns like these 3 blocks of Halsted in East Pilsen. And I think that's really interesting to know. So let's turn on, actually, you can just click on it. So right here where Podjemierski owns his properties, we can see that in the last 10 years, that's actually not that much. Rent has gone up 16% in the census tract. And so if we actually have that one, oh, did I not? No, yeah, here it is. So these are census tracts by the percent that the rent has changed in the last 10 years according to the census. Yeah, you can look at this one. The rent has gone up 82% in that block between Halsted and Canal in Pilsen in the last 10 years. And so this is a gold mine. The city is a monopoly board, and the developers are just there's a gold mine out here. 79% increase in rent. Yeah, so I think, the city's changing really fast. The country is changing really fast. And I think it's really powerful to be able to visualize the concentration of property ownership and the consequences that the basically monopoly board system we have are for the community and the people that live in these neighborhoods, who are born in these neighborhoods and who should have a right to stay in them.
Yeah, thank you for walking, us through the more details of like how you would tell that story. So another question is about, I guess, the back and forth with government and landlords. So the question is, does this data enable local government to take action against problem landlords? And attached to that is in your methodology, you mentioned that data quality issues limit the connections you can make. So then there's a question about, are there straightforward policy changes that you'd recommend regarding the data quality?
Yes, first and foremost, create and enforce standards for the data that's submitted by these landlords. I actually made a form because I wanted to give landlords the chance to update their data in the site, basically, in case their data is not being updated. If they bought a building and it says that they have all these violations, I want them to be able to let me know. So I created this form where landlords can submit their data to me. And it's a form similar to this, is what landlords should be required by Cook County to submit their property tax data. Legal first name, last name, the mailing address. Ideally, you would have a service that you type in an address and then it just auto fills it. So you don't need to validate them, because validating addresses is really clumsy. You also have to enforce the suite numbers, because there is a lot of missing suite numbers and taxpayer addresses that just went to office buildings with no suite number. So enforcing the validation of the addresses, whether or not the property is held in a trust. If it is held in a trust, what is the name of that trust institution, and what's a unique identifier for that trust product that you have held with the institution? And what was the other one? And also if you
policy.
have the, of course, if you have a company, a shell company or other any company that is the taxpayer, you need to provide the all the company data right there in the taxpayer record and not force data scientists to do all the merges and just have all that data right collected at the source. Another big policy thing, and I know this just failed in Chicago in the last year, but a landlord registry. We need landlords to register themselves and their properties because when tenants need to seek justice in court and the judge tells them they sued the wrong person, they sued the property management company, you're actually supposed to sue the real landlord. That's unacceptable. There needs to be a registry with the landlord's names, addresses, with personally identifiable information where tenants can easily access so that if they ever do need to take their landlord to court, they're not wasting weeks and months with all these legal bureaucratic tasks and they can just get right to it. And so those are probably the biggest in terms of like quick fix policy issues to improve the data and improve this kind of um, study and the kind of insights you can get from this data. And yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. Go to the next question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I feel like those data quality questions are definitely like applicable, like, generally relevant to a lot of civic tech projects. And I think like very, very much worth thinking about. I think we're going to transition to a couple questions. Um, so one of these questions is, how would you like to receive feedback, like questions or bugs that people find about the project?
Emails are open. Contact at landlordmapper.org. I'll throw that in the chat at the end. Emails are wide open. Feel free to email me anytime. You can submit the data on these forms. Of course, I got more forms. If you search your landlord's name and nothing shows up, uh, search your landlord's name, nothing shows up, you can click on this let us know, and you can submit landlord data that you know about. I've already got submissions and I've read someone sent me some wild stuff already.
Mhm.
Um, but if you want to get some on the ground information into this space that the Landlord Mapper initiative is trying to create, you can go ahead and fill out this form. Doesn't collect your email. You don't need to give your name or anything. And same with the address. So if you search your address and nothing shows up, you can just click on that, let us know. There is, see, where's the other? Yeah, so those are the two biggest ways, the email and the form. Also follow on Twitter, follow on X, formerly known as Twitter. Got the X up.
Yeah. Yeah, so okay, so that's for basically everyday folks, like tenants. There's also, if we want to broaden it, I know you threw the GitHub up there. Uh, are there other ways that folks can help out with the project? So they've heard about it, they found out about it, and they're like, how more can I help if I'm like a developer? Um,
That's great. If anyone has the time and the bandwidth uh, and the interest, the data methodology is not perfect, and I think having extra eyes on it could make it a lot better. I'm very much open to critiques of the methodology and of the code workflow that I wrote up. So definitely, we'll be taking a look at pull requests and yeah, the question of how people can help is tough because there's so much to do,
yeah.
and it's almost like more effort to up to this point, it has been more effort to like figure out what to delegate and how to delegate it than actually just doing it myself. But now that it's up, I think it'll be a little more relaxed pace. And so the manual address research is another area where if people could sit there, spend, I don't know, an hour a week, 2 hours a week, Googling these taxpayer addresses, it's interesting. So it will be interesting if anyone's interested in it. But if we could organize people doing that and grow that landlord entities database table that I told you about that comes from the manually researched taxpayer mailing addresses, that could make the data a lot more powerful. And also, with more people talking about it and thinking about it, could probably refine the data model to more precisely reflect the domain relationships between like LLCs and trusts and whatnot.
Wow, thank you so much, Dylan. And of course, I think there have been some great questions here. Um, a really good problem to have is that we weren't able to go through every single one of the questions, but I'm sure there'd be, folks who'd be interested in talking more about Landlord Mapper when we, finish the presentation section and then we move on to the next section. So, um, let me see here. Okay, so we're at about 7:50, 7:50, 7:58. Um, so Dylan, thank you so much for the presentation tonight. What's going to happen now is in a few minutes at 8 o'clock, we are going to transition to the post presentation, and then we're going to do some three-word introductions of folks in the community, and then we're going to do some breakout pitches and perhaps talk more. So stay tuned, everybody, and we're going to be back in a few minutes at 8 p.m.